So, quick update. Second Chance is coming back very soon with new episodes on a hopefully more regular schedule, but before then, I wanted to do something a little different, with a brief dive into something more contemporary than the usual subjects. In this case, the very new Terminator Dark Fate. The general reception of this movie has been pretty positive for the most part, and a little mixed at worst, as you'd expect. People always have lots of conflicted feelings about follow-ups to pop culture classics. But I don't think that many would disagree that this is the best Terminator sequel since Terminator 2, whether you consider that a low bar or not.
Talk to the hand.
And while there are a few things I didn't love about the movie, most of them are very, very minor. And of course, other people's larger criticisms are totally valid. But one of the most common and biggest criticisms, one that's related to the story's entire reason for existence, is one that I can't really get behind. And in fact shows a pretty profound misunderstanding for what Dark Fate is ultimately doing, particularly for the character of Sarah Connor. So huge, massive, giant spoilers here. We're not going to sugarcoat anything. Seriously, just see the movie. John Connor dies right at the beginning of the movie, and not because of any wacky time travel related shenanigans. He's just gunned down as a very young teen, with the exact same haircut he had when he was 10, in a moment of hesitation because his killer had the same face of the only father he ever had. This of course answers the question that many pedantic nerds have had for decades. Why didn't Skynet send back multiple Terminators at a time? Well, yeah, turns out they did, and even though Sarah, John, and Uncle Bob did successfully abort Skynet in T2 and change the timeline, the Terminators that were sent back before they changed it still existed in the past, still found John, and still had a mission to kill him. And by this one finding him when the Connors had their guard down, it succeeded. So that's a bummer. The big criticism then is what TV tropes deems happy ending override, that the poignant and powerful ending to T2, which masterfully culminated 2 movies full of abject cynicism and dread into a catharsis of hope and optimism, well, it never mattered because shit went south anyway. You can see this reflected in pretty much any negative review and even in a few of the positive ones, that it undercuts the impact of the first film and the follow-up, and that despite Linda Hamilton returning to the role of Sarah Connor, it doesn't matter because the future that made her important died with John, and that deciding to lose John Connor early on in this one made the emotional heart of the first 2 classic Terminator films stop beating as well. The complaints feel valid at the surface, and had the movie played out differently, I'd agree with them. But what the movie ends up doing with this conceit isn't just a hook to make this a sequel with something to do, it actually retroactively colors the arc of the first 2 films, and of Sarah Connor, in a way that actually manages to strengthen a character that was already one of the strongest characters ever created on screen. A lot of elements end up defining Sarah Connor in the first 2 films, but the major beats are how she responds to immense trauma, how she responds to the weight of being the mother of the most important person in the world, and how she responds to the weight of the world being on her shoulders when she actually carries an immense love for humanity. Terminator 2 in particular is brilliant in exploring how all of those elements often compound and conflict with one another. For example, her empathy for humanity and the horror at the thought of them brutally dying hypocritically drives her to try and murder a human herself, and traumatize his family the same way that she was traumatized. Sarah is a woman full of contradictions, and her confusion manifests in psychosis and moments of remembering who she used to be and what she is now. And her arc in T2 is about coalescing those contradictions into someone stable enough to be a good mom to John, which she only does after seeing the humanity in both John and the T-800.
Because if a machine, a Terminator, can learn the value of human life, maybe we can too.
But the lens all of this has been shown through is Sarah being the mother of the most important person in the world. She's the person who creates, raises, and most likely dies for someone more important than her. She's a cipher for a hero, and not a hero herself, according to the mythology. More akin to a textbook and body armor than a worthwhile human being. That sounds harsh, but I think that's how Sarah ultimately saw herself by the time T2 rolled around. All her guilt and pain and grief didn't just harden her as a soldier, but made her see herself as disposable as long as John could live on.
What were you thinking? You cannot risk yourself even for me. Do you understand? You're too important.
That makes the question of Dark Fate even more tragic and poignant. It's not just about the horrific tragedy of a mother losing a son, which, yeah, is already like the worst trauma any person could ever go through. But for her, it's her entire sense of purpose and existence. And the only thing that maybe made the insurmountable bad things she's gone through even the slightest bit worth it. So yeah, the beginning of Dark Fate, really sucks. And it does start the movie off with a dreary, bad taste in your mouth. Kinda not unlike like finding out at the beginning of T2 that after everything Sarah went through in the first movie, she's been relegated to an undignified mental institution where she's sexually assaulted by the guards. But also, like T2, Dark Fate finds a way to bring hope to the awful situations, particularly in the larger conversation about Sarah's purpose. One minor quibble I have about this movie is that it's maybe a little too unsubtle about this part. Sarah lays out very directly that she has no real purpose other than hunting Terminators and drinking until she blacks out. Then Carl the Terminator later says he contacted Sarah not just because he developed a sense of remorse over John's death, but more to give Sarah a purpose like he gave himself one. And we later learn that Danny, the new most important person in the world, becomes not the mother of the Resistance, but the leader of the Resistance. Sarah explicitly says twice, she's John. So it's pretty obvious what they're doing here, right? Sarah's purpose used to be protecting John died, and now she found a new John and thus a revitalized purpose. I can see why that feels really empty and cynical on the outset, and reflective of many criticisms of the film as a whole. What Dark Fate does feels akin to what The Force Awakens did with Star Wars, in fact, and has garnered similar compliments and complaints. It essentially takes a lot of the greatest hits of everything that came before it, and recycles a lot of very similar character and story beats, but puts new spins on them for a modern audience. It's understandable to maybe feel like it undoes the happy ending for the original characters, though if you're gonna have a sequel, then, there's definitely gonna be conflicts. I also understand thinking these movies are a bit too derivative of their original films.
I'll be back.
But especially in Terminator's case, they're films that operate on conversations about the nature of fate and time and legacy. So it makes sense in universe and in their philosophies that larger events will repeat themselves in a time as a flat circle kind of way. But Dark Fate is not just slotting in Danny for John, or at least that's not all that's happening. Another bit of unsubtle dialogue in the film, but one that I think works a lot better given Sarah's penchant to monologue and cynically philosophize.
Feel it growing inside you. All you know how to create is death and destruction.
Mom! We need to be a little more constructive here, okay?
Is when, upon learning that Danny's story is almost identical to Sarah's,
Because I was her.
and assuming that, like her, Danny will be the mother to a man that saves the future, Sarah tells her, they're not after you, they're after your womb. It's a pretty clear picture of what Sarah thinks of herself. Perhaps the one sort of uncomfortable thing about the conception of Sarah Connor as a female character is how defined she is by being the mother to the most important guy in the world, something even Linda Hamilton herself has criticized about her character. In Dark Fate, Sarah even disparagingly refers to herself as Mother Mary. We see this aspect of Sarah put into the spotlight through Danny, who Sarah fully 100% sees herself in every way until she sees her as John. But I don't think one perception overrides the other, and the real moment here is that she can see both herself and her messianic son in one person. Danny is still Sarah, but Danny is also more than just her womb. Ergo, Sarah herself is more than just her womb. I've already seen plenty of criticisms that this part of the film is just about updating the movies to be more woke feminist, because this is obviously the first Terminator iteration that has ever featured women at the forefront in action roles.
You're a terminated fucker.
But it's not just posturing here, because this is Sarah's arc. It's one of learning a sense of self-worth, and that it is possible to have another purpose. Now, one quick note about time travel. The thing about time travel between Terminator and T2 is that it's a little bit inconsistent. Terminator has a time loop with Kyle fathering John and Skynet fathering itself, only for T2 to turn around and say to hell with that, no fate will we make for ourselves, which Dark Fate, and like every single sequel, fully confirms by saying, yes, actually you can change the timeline, because they did stop Skynet, and they won. Plenty of nerds have made complicated theories and maps of the multiverse to figure out the mechanics of how all this works, but for the sake of the more abstract theme and story, it's safe to say that sometimes timelines change, sometimes there are time paradoxes. This also works in Dark Fate's favor, because as we see with Danny and Grace's relationship, it seems built on the two of them knowing one another in their respective pasts and futures. And I think it works for Sarah and Danny's relationship too. Dark Fate ends with an inversion of the Terminator 1 ending, with the two of them driving in a suburb, and Sarah becoming a new mentor to Danny. But it also suggests that the future Danny that Grace knew was probably also mentored and taught by Sarah. She isn't just a good organized leader in the future we see, she's also a great fighter and a total badass, things that would make more sense to be learned from Sarah in the first place. So, whether Skynet or Legion or whoever is rising up to kill us all, a leader will rise to save us, and that leader will always be taught by Sarah Connor. And this is ultimately what the point of Dark Fate is. is. Sarah saw that Carl the Terminator was able to move on from his previous purpose and forge a new path with a new purpose, using the lessons he learned from his past life. Sarah, conversely, had been stuck in the same place for 22 years, refusing to say goodbye and move on because she thought her entire reason for existence was living for John. But as she learns by meeting Carl and Danny, living for John also means living in honor of him, and using the things she learned in her experiences raising him to help other people. She accomplished her first mission in stopping Skynet, and even though she lost John, she can still stop Legion, or whatever evil force rises up to destroy the world. Sarah's journey and purpose right from the beginning of the first Terminator was never just to give birth to some dude who would magically have all the skills to lead a resistance. It was to raise the person and teach those skills, and instill the same strength in them that she had. Her role as Mother of the Future isn't to be a literal biological mother who expels the Messiah from her womb. It's to be a mother figure, a teacher, and a guardian to whoever needs her guidance to be their best selves. John was never the most important person in the world. It was always Sarah.